just making sure that there are very open lines of communication and a lot of collaboration between brand marketing and SEO within your company, if those are two separate roles. If you're a solo marketer, then just try to incorporate as often as you can this thought process of bringing brand into everything that you do in content marketing, and basically making sure that you're taking every opportunity to develop and convey your identity to your audience in a meaningful way. And then just measure everything that you're doing so that you know what works best for you and your audience and your product space. Create deep associations between your product, your audience, and that's going to have the biggest impact both on SEO and AEO, GEO, LLMs, if that's something that you're aiming for as well. I'm Christian Rigg, and this is SEO in 2025, Additional Insights.
Christian, what's your additional insight for SEO in 2025?
So my insight is that with the rise of AI experiences and an increase in branded search, there's never been a better time to focus on bridging any gaps that exist today between your SEO and brand marketing in your strategy, and ensuring that these two essential instruments are working together in really perfect harmony.
Okay, so talking about gaps that exist between SEO and brand marketing, what are some typical gaps that actually exist here?
Yeah, for sure. Good question. I think many. And I think part of it comes from the fact that, at least in my experience, one of the things that I've seen in a lot of the businesses that we've worked with at 11 is that SEO can kind of happen in a silo. Like SEO has a very strong identity of its own and very clear objectives of what it wants to achieve. It's got its own terminology. It takes a really scientific kind of approach to things. And that doesn't always leave a lot of space for other important parts of marketing, like brand marketing, which of course is the, building an identity and presenting that identity to the world. And so I find that a lot of times SEO and the deliverables for SEO, they tend to be very information focused, which makes a lot of sense because, Google can't really measure emotional impact, on the page. So its goal has been to serve answers to users. And so SEO has been very focused on this idea of providing the right information at the right time to the right people, which is an excellent goal for sure. But it misses the kind of emotional impact that brand marketing brings. I think that that's something that very often gets left out, or maybe sprinkled on at the end, with a style guide that says, make sure that you speak in this way. But without it being really core to the way that you're producing content, that emotional resonance doesn't really stick. And we know that people make decisions emotionally, even when they believe they're being rational. All decision making is emotional on a neurological and psychological level. Bridging the gap between those two things is really important.
I'm intrigued by this phrase, emotional resonance, in relation to brand marketing and how it can impact SEO and how SEOs can work more effectively with brands in order to actually accomplish that and different content that they publish. I mean, how does an SEO go about doing that? And also, has the role of brand actually changed because of SEO and where a brand appears? And I guess a third question is, what is the role of SEO and brand? Can that be done by a singular person, or are the roles too different still? Is it still necessary to have two different skill sets and just those people working together to do this?
Yeah, for sure. It's a super interesting question. I mean, there definitely is value. I'm going to answer these in reverse order, I think. So I'll try to keep them in my head. So in terms of whether we need separate roles, I don't think necessarily no, because one of the, I think, really central arguments to take away from this insight, from this tip, is the fact that really excellent SEO shares all of the same qualities as, or many of the same qualities anyway, as really great brand marketing. And all of those share all the same properties of just, really good marketing, which is, clear messaging, having a strong identity, building deep associations between your product space, and your audience. And that third one's a really interesting one because we know that LLMs are very associative in the way that they understand content that's out in the wild, whether through training or retrieval augmented generation, and how they present it to the user. One of the key parts that I've seen of like GEO or AEO is building these associations, these relationships, really strong associations like Kleenex and tissues, or Dove and natural beauty. These deep associations between your brand and the space where you operate is really, really key. I think one person can do this because if you understand the basics of really good marketing, then you should understand the basics of really good SEO and really good brand marketing. Obviously, there's power in differentiation. There's so much to learn and to know in SEO and in brand marketing that if a company has the resources for it, absolutely have those two roles, but make sure that they're not siloed and make sure that they're working really, really closely together, which again is something that we've often seen as a problem in the companies that we work with. But if you're just a solo marketer, I don't think that you have to choose. And in fact, on the contrary, I would say that bringing the best of SEO and brand marketing together is how you're going to succeed at SEO and brand marketing, because the two are actually really complementary, even though they've kind of tended to operate in separate spaces recently.
I think certain brand marketers have an advantage because obviously you mentioned Kleenex there as well. That was actually started in 1924 and it was essentially a first mover in the space. They were actually invented to remove cream from your face, but it was the first kind of type of product in its niche. And obviously the same type of example could possibly be hoovers. People talk about hoovering a floor instead of vacuuming a floor. Do you think that in order to get that distinct descriptive phrase in relation to your brand, you need to be a first mover in your niche or do something that will make you relatively unique in the eyes of the consumer? Or is it possible for a brand that has perhaps hundreds of competitors to develop that same strong brand presence and relationship to a particular descriptive phrase?
Yeah, for sure. So the answer is definitely the last two things that you said. Yes, you absolutely can create a strong brand identity without being the first one on the scene. I actually read a really interesting article maybe 2 or 3 years ago, and I honestly wouldn't be able to remember the name or the publication, but that was looking at this idea of the fact that historically, first comers aren't actually the most likely to succeed, and that you don't need to be the first one on the scene. And I could be wrong, but I want to say that they used Uber as an example because there were other, companies like them that came first and kind of laid the groundwork, but never really caught on. And so just like you said in your third point, it absolutely is simply a question of finding the thing that makes you unique, turning that into a really compelling brand identity that people connect with on an emotional level, that creates some kind of emotional connection, whether it's, joy or excitement or solace or whatever, and then building upon that. So yeah, I don't think it's necessary to be the first one on the scene. It might help, but some data suggests that being the first one isn't all that good because you're the one who makes all the mistakes. Then somebody else gets to sweep in with like a finished product.
How does an SEO know that that hasn't got a great deal of experience in brand marketing if their brand messaging is up to speed, if it's sufficient enough, if it's really as good as it needs to be? Because obviously they don't have the experience in doing that. So how do they know when to question it and what to suggest?
Yeah, for sure. I'd say there's two important things to do. First of all, trust your instincts. If you have an inkling that maybe things aren't as strong as they could be, if you, have to sit down and think, what is our identity as a company? And there's not a lot of internal resources that dictate it. And if it hasn't been a part of your process as an SEO to be thinking about what value, what company value am I going to incorporate into this piece that I'm writing, whether it's, a how-to article or a product, review or whatever. If that hasn't been a part of your process, then it may well be that the brand, identity isn't strong enough. And if you don't have the capacity to do that, and there's not somebody else in your company that has the capacity to do that, then hire a consultant or pair with an agency. The cost is well worth it to even just check if you're on the right path. But if something doesn't feel totally right, it's probably not, because when your company has a strong brand intuitively, right? And if it doesn't feel like you have a strong brand and you're representing it well through the deliverables that you're producing and the content that you're putting out there, then find somebody who can help you with that. There's lots of excellent consultants available on LinkedIn. There's lots of fantastic agencies out there. Find somebody who has the knowledge, who can accompany you for a short period, show you what you need to be doing and train you up on it. And then you'll have those skills for life.
How do you incorporate a company value into a piece of content without it becoming too salesy and without losing direction in terms of the keyword targeting that you're aiming for?
Yeah, for sure. It's a good question. And it's also a question in brand marketing, because a lot of the, I'd say, errors that people make is trying to say who they are rather than demonstrate who they are. So like saying that you're a transparent company rather than doing things that demonstrates transparency. So some of the things that you can do in a piece of content to demonstrate your values is like incorporate customer success stories, not in a salesy way, but, as almost like an offhand, and incidentally at 11, one of our clients was able to X, Y, and Z. It has to be relevant to whatever it is that you're talking about. It has to be done in an organic and natural way. But customer success stories are a really good one. Behind the scenes stuff is something that people we know engage with really strong, especially on social media, where you can do reels or TikToks where you show what's going on like in the office or a day in the life of. But there's absolutely no reason that those kinds of things can't also be brought into written pieces and even content where you might not think it sits naturally. It takes creativity for sure. You do have to hone and develop those creative muscles, but it's something that we do at 11 for all of our clients. And one of the ways that we do it is we have a dedicated section in the brief that the subject matter expert who's writing the piece can refer back to, where the account manager, who's familiar with the brand and kind of serves as like the guardian of the brand with the work that we do, they'll specifically call out company values or company pillars or principles that make sense for this piece and offer suggestions on ways that it can be incorporated. And once you get in the habit of doing that and you find out what works well for your brand and the kind of content that you're producing, then it just becomes part of your workflow. It's work up front, but it becomes a sustainable workflow.
What does this look like strategically if there's an SEO and a brand marketer within an organization? Do they sit at the same table together and work together constantly? Do they meet up weekly or quarterly and define whatever strategy they're going to have for content for the coming 3 months?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I would say in an ideal world that, you would want to be getting together and speaking about, if not every piece, then, each campaign or series of pieces that you're doing, any of the really big, important kind of hefty content that you might be doing as an SEO or content marketer. So like white papers, ebooks, original research, thought leadership, which original research and thought leadership are fantastic ways to bridge the gap between SEO and brand marketing. I would say that, you would definitely want to get input from a brand marketer on the best way to weave those things in together. And you may find that in the beginning, it takes a lot of collaboration. But again, over time, both the SEO and the brand marketer will start to develop the skills necessary for working together. And an SEO can learn everything that they need to know, or virtually everything that they need to know, to keep things running on a day-to-day basis. it's kind of like the connection that you want to have between marketing and sales, which again, despite both of them being so important for growth, in a lot of companies, there is this kind of divide between marketing and sales. And, the more that you can connect those things, the stronger both sides are. And I think the same is true with brand marketing and SEO. So if that looks like a once a week sit down for 30, 45 minutes, just to make sure that everything is aligned and brainstorm ideas on how we can take, content where you might not naturally think that something like brand marketing can fit in, because, sometimes it does take creativity. Those kinds of brainstorming sessions, just on the Monday at 45 minutes, and you've got at least a couple really solid ideas for how to start implementing these things. And then keep a record of those ideas, refer back to them when you need to, add them into briefs, and eventually it just, again, becomes part of the process.
And how do you measure the ROI of doing a better job of incorporating your brand messaging within your content?
So normally I would say like an increase in branded searches and an increase in branded links is a good indicator. Right now, obviously, LLMs have led to this kind of natural increase in branded search anyway. So for the next couple of months, at least, I would say things are going to be a little bit chaotic on that front. And you may not necessarily know whether it's directly attributable to the efforts that you're making there or the fact that LLMs are pushing people to do more branded searches. But that's definitely one metric that you want to follow regardless. And, eventually the dust will settle with LLMs. We'll have a new status quo and you can start to get a clearer reading. Another good measure can be with a tool like Hotjar, or something that allows to see where people are pausing on the page and where they're interacting. If you notice a lot of activity around the parts of your content where you're telling a brand story, like customer success stories or like the behind the scenes kind of content we mentioned, that's a good notion that people are kind of interacting with it. And then other than that, just a lot of experimentation and like A/B testing. You need a good attribution framework that allows you to see how your content is performing at like different strategy levels, which is the topic of the talk that I'll be giving at Brighton SEO in October. But the best way to do it is to try different things and see which works best, mainly in terms of conversion, I would say. Because with brand marketing, one of the things that you really want to hone in on is, are we connecting so much with the audience that we're compelling them to make a buying decision? So being able to see what of your content is performing if you try different things like customer success stories in maybe one series of articles, behind the scenes stuff in another series of articles. Compare the conversion levels on those two things over time. And that kind of thing can give you a really good idea of what's working well for you and what's not, and where you should be putting your time and resources.
Christian, what's the key takeaway from the tip you shared today?
So the key takeaway from the tip that I shared today, I would say, is just making sure that there are very open lines of communication and a lot of collaboration between brand marketing and SEO within your company, if those are two separate roles. If you're a solo marketer, then just try to incorporate as often as you can this thought process of bringing brand into everything that you do in content marketing, and basically making sure that you're taking every opportunity to develop and convey your identity to your audience in a meaningful way. And then just measure everything that you're doing so that you know what works best for you and your audience and your product space. Create deep associations between your product, your audience, and that's going to have the biggest impact both on SEO and AEO, GEO, LLMs, if that's something that you're aiming for as well.
Christian Rigg is the operations director at 11 Writing, and you can find him over at 11writing.com. Christian, thanks so much for adding your additional insight to SEO in 2025.
My absolute pleasure. Thanks so much for having me, David.
I've been your host, David Bain, and you've been listening to SEO in 2025 Additional Insights, a Majestic series that complements the original podcast, video series, and book. Find out more at SEOin2025.com.